Good morning, everyone. First of all, happy EITC Awareness Day, and welcome to It's Not Like I'm Poor, New Research and Political Prospects for the Earned Income Tax Credit and Volunteer Income Tax Assistance. My name is Lauren Pescatori, and I'm the Director of Tax Credits for Working Families. We are a nonpartisan communications campaign led by the Hatcher Group to promote tax credits like the EITC at both the state and federal level. We've worked with CFED for a long time now, and we're thrilled to be partnering with them today to bring you this event. This year marks the 40th anniversary of the EITC's enactment by Congress in 1975. The EITC is widely regarded as one of the nation's most powerful anti-poverty programs, yet 1 in every 5 eligible workers does not claim the credit. We've brought you here today to not only discuss the importance of the EITC, but also the vital role that volunteer income tax assistance plays in ensuring that every eligible worker is able to receive the credit. In the folders provided for you, you'll find resources from CFED, the Center on Budget, and ourselves. And I would encourage you after the event to visit our website, www.taxcreditsforworkingfamilies.org, to view our recent video interview with one of our keynote speakers today, Professor Kathryn Edin, on her latest book on the American Safety Net. So without further ado, I would like to introduce a dear friend of the Hatcher Groups and President of the Corporation for Enterprise Development, Andrea Levere.
Thank you, Lauren. It is such a pleasure for us to be co-hosting this event with tax credits for working families. I'm Andrea Levere, president of CFED, and as several people said, it's my coming out day because I just came back from a major injury, and it is my theme that this is a day about hope. And what the EITC has brought to families is core to CFED's mission, that it's not just about income, but it's also about assets. And our whole philosophy is that we want to help people build their future by being able to invest in long-term assets that help them live the American dream. I am especially grateful to my dear friend Lisa Adams, who introduced us to Kathy Edin and her insightful book on the EITC. Those who read it can see that it is much about how this works as really heart-wrenching stories about how people make their lives work under incredibly difficult and challenging circumstances. And all of us here are dedicated to public policies who make it easier for people to be the productive, flourishing people that we all want them to be. We are thrilled to be hosting this event because the EITC and the Volunteer Income Tax Assistance Program fits so well with our mission. Last year, CFED formally took on a portfolio of work to advance policy and programs that specifically aim to provide low and moderate income taxpayers with new tax time opportunities. And I'm happy to recognize the new Taxpayer Opportunity Network, which brings together organizations and individuals who provide tax assistance to low-income communities. This work also builds on our experience with the Assets and Opportunity Network, which is a national network that brings movement-oriented advocates, practitioners, policymakers, and others to expand the reach and impact of asset-building strategies in every community in the United States. And so I am greatly pleased to invite David Rothstein, who's a long-term member of the Assets and Opportunity Network, to introduce Senator Brown, who has been such a champion of both the EITC and VITA. David, you may think we picked him just because he's from Ohio, but that wouldn't be the truth. Even more importantly, he's been a tireless advocate for expanding tax time opportunities for low and moderate income Americans, particularly as Director of Research Development and Public Affairs for the Neighborhood Housing Services of Greater Cleveland. But the other great thing about David is he's one of the few people in America who make me look shy. So David, welcome.
Following Andrea Levere is never an easy opportunity, just given the energy that she brings. So thank you, Andrea, and to Lauren for starting our morning with so much energy and on point. It is such a great pleasure for me to introduce our first keynote speaker, Senator Sherrod Brown, here today. Senator Brown hails from our great state of Ohio, and he's always quite proud of it. My parents are, of course, overjoyed that I'm introducing a sitting senator, and my graduate school friends, us policy wonks, are more excited that I'm with Professor Edin. So it's all about perspective. Speaking of perspectives, there are so many different facets to asset building through the EITC, and if I can sort of touch on one policy that's not directly part of the panel and this conversation this morning, it would be to emphasize the growing importance of the delivery system for the EITC. And in Professor Edin's book, she also touches on this issue. If families are paying upward of $500 to receive tax assistance and additional dollars to get their refunds put on debit cards, they're losing their earned income, and they're being gouged, quite frankly. Tax preparers, they must be regulated, and they should be required to provide good faith estimates before and not after their tax return is prepared. So I'm excited today that, working with my colleagues at the New America Foundation, we've released a report this morning that calls for such measures, including a fee disclosure box very similar to what's been going on with credit cards and prepaid debit cards, and we have that white paper right outside. But more so on point, to talk about perspective, Senator Brown is a longtime supporter and innovative thinker around the Earned Income Tax Credit. His past bills include supporting the permanent expansion of the ARA additions of a third child of coverage for the EITC and a longer phase-out range for married filers. The federal EITC is a $2 billion program in Ohio, and Senator Brown understands that working families and their communities need these dollars for economic development and for achieving and growing assets. Senator Brown's newest bill we're particularly excited about. It's right on target for advancing some EITC dollars to help working families pay bills, to save, and to achieve assets throughout the year and not just at tax time. And if it functions as a method to help families not use payday loans, I'm doubly excited, and I know his office is as well. Here are a quick couple things that you might not have known about Senator Brown in the EITC. When he was Representative Sherrod Brown, he ran a free tax preparation site out of his Lorain County office just outside of Cleveland. There wasn't an active VITA site, so he opened up his office to being one. For the past few years, the senator has worked with us tirelessly to increase funding for free tax preparation by 3 times the amount that was currently funded through the IRS to ensure that working families would pay $0 at tax time to secure their EITC. So again, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Senator, for coming to speak. Thank you for your dedicated staff who's always working on the EITC. There is some time after the senator speaks, about 5 minutes for questions and answers, so please prepare those. So, Senator, thank you.
David, thank you, and thank all of you for, and Andrea, I'm glad you're back at work. I don't know what the injury was, but you look great, so congratulations. And Dr. Edin, thank you for your contribution to this debate and how important it is. And to all of you, Chai-Ching Wang, who has been particularly important, talking to the White House, educating them, helping Gideon in our office and others, so thank you for your terrific work. This is my real voice. I talk this way. I don't smoke. I'm not sick. I just talk this way. And this is a true story I'm about to tell you. My wife and I were at an event in a room about this size, but no tables and chairs, and people were all sort of crammed together. And there were 3 or 4 of us that were speaking just for a couple of minutes, took the stage and began to talk. And this guy standing next to my wife, she had never seen before, and he turned to her as I was speaking and said, "I hate that guy's voice." And she said, "Really?" And he said, "Yeah, when that guy speaks, man, it's like fingernails on a blackboard. I can't stand listening to that guy." She said, "Well, I kind of like his voice." And he said, "You like that guy's voice?" And she said, "Yeah, I do." She said, "You know when I really like it?" And he goes, "When?" And she goes like this and leans in. He leans in and said, "I really like it when he wakes me up in the middle of the night and says, 'I love you, baby.'" So, that's a true story. My wife's a very good writer. She's a Pulitzer Prize winner. She has like the best Facebook ever. Her name is, right, David? Right, David? And her name is Connie Schultz, so check it out. Anyway, and you will laugh at more things than I just told you. So, David, thank you. David is such a gem and so important in Northeast Ohio. He's testified a number of times to subcommittees that I have chaired that deal with financial issues. He's now at Neighborhood Housing Services in Cleveland and has just been a terrific advocate for people who frankly don't have a voice, no matter what it sounds like. And he is so valuable to Northeast Ohio, and you can tell your parents that. And your academic friends, you can tell them that too, okay? So, I was at about a year ago this month, and on a cold, snowy Cleveland day, I went to Martin Luther King Day breakfast, and a minister there said something that we all know. I mean, we all know this is true, but he probably said it better than at least I'd ever said it. He said, your life expectancy is connected to your zip code. Your life expectancy is connected to your zip code. And you can, whether you grow up in Appalachia, Ohio, or you grow up in East Cleveland, a very poor inner city suburb, if you will, inner ring suburb, whether you grow up in Shaker Heights or whether you grow up in an affluent suburb or wherever you grow up, your life expectancy clearly is determined in many ways. Quality of health care, whether you get a good education, social support necessary, that you have from the neighborhood organizations, all of that. Obviously, it shouldn't be that way in a country this rich. My state, embarrassingly, is 48th in the country in infant mortality. It's 50th for black infant mortality. We're not a poor state, but we're a state that is underinvested in public health and underinvested in early childhood education and underinvested in the kind of safety net that really does give people opportunity. And so many low-income people in our state pay for it every day. It's an economic, a moral, a political issue. A recent poll found that 63% of Americans believe the U.S. economic system favors the wealthy. So well over half of Americans think the system, think their government works more for Wall Street than it does for Main Street, and works better for the elite and the wealthy in this country than it does for people who have little opportunity. When workers' wages stagnate, when they struggle to provide for their families, we have a moral problem. When people who work hard and take responsibility and do the best they can, but when they believe the economy is rigged against them, we have a political problem. And when the next generation of workers retires with little savings, little or no savings, and no defined pension benefit anymore, we have an economic problem. That's why the EITC and the child tax credit are so very, very important. You know its history. It's almost close to 40 years old now. Expanded by every single president. It's been, most importantly, of course, it rewards work. The EITC expansions of the 90s led more than 500,000 single mothers to move from cash welfare assistance to work. Double the results of welfare reform, which I opposed when I was in the House, and welfare reform clearly didn't do anything close to what it was heralded to do. We know whatever it did do, that the Earned Income Tax Reform did much more, Earned Income Tax Credit did much more. It's lifted more children above the poverty line than any other government program. In 2012 alone, more than 28 million American households, almost 1 million people in my state benefited from EITC, average credit $2,300. You know these numbers. It's important to emphasize that it's important that we tell stories around these numbers. And let me do that. We can stand up in front of people and talk to her blue in the face about public policy, but we need to tell stories, as you know, tell stories about whom this affects and the effect on them. Juan Alicia Duran in Cleveland told me last year that she lives paycheck to paycheck, but getting the EITC every March or April is the one time of year she can actually pay off her bills. Rose Ali of Toledo works as a manager at a fast food restaurant, $9.35 an hour. I mean, think about that. She's the manager of the restaurant. She's making $9.35 an hour. She says her family struggles to pay bills. The EITC has been a lifesaver since she found out about it through her local VITA center. Thousands and thousands of stories like this have lifted people above poverty and made a huge, huge difference in their lives. In the State of the Union address, I thought perhaps President Obama's best one, 2 weeks ago, he laid out plans to reform the tax code by making EITC and CTC permanent and expanding credits for workers and middle-class families to raise children and save for retirement. If you work in this town or you live in this town and you hang around these buildings, what you hear about tax reform is almost always we've got to lower the corporate tax rate. That's how the debate has begun. But that's not how we can't let the debate begin that way. The president, I thought, for the first time, emphatically in his State of the Union, began to change that debate, that we're not going to have corporate tax reform until and unless we expand EITC, we make the expansions permanent, we expand them, we make the expansions for TCC, CTC and EITC permanent. Otherwise, we don't attract the broad support for any kind of tax reform. And I think the president, and no tax breaks for corporations without tax breaks for working families, period. It's something we should be able to agree on. We know in the past that EITC and CTC have, as minimum wage used to be. My first speech on the Senate floor in 2007 was in support of the minimum wage bill. It was signed by President Bush. It was a bipartisan bill. Real quick story about that. First speech, January 2007, just been elected to the Senate. Presiding officer was Barack Obama, Senator Obama, and I stood up, and when you stand up in the Senate, you address the chair, and my first words in January 2007 to him was, "Mr. President," and I think he liked the sound of it. So, anyway, it's a true story, but probably not entirely true. My State of the Union guest 2-3 weeks ago was Jason Jacobs, a Cincinnati resident, graduated from Ohio University, grew up as a kind of a middle-class, working-class kid. Got a degree to teach at Ohio University, hasn't been able to find a job as a teacher. He is now working as a paraprofessional in the West Claremont School District just to the east of Hamilton County where Cincinnati is. He made only about $16,000 last year. And because he doesn't have children, he'll miss out on critical tax credits that could put more of his money in his pocket. My legislation that David mentioned, the Working Families Tax Relief Act, would nearly triple the size of the EITC for workers without children. It would expand access to young workers. It would make permanent enhancement of EITC and CTC that will expire in 2017. Expanding the childless EITC is in our legislation that President Obama proposed in the State of the Union, will lift more than 500,000 people out of poverty and will reduce the poverty for an additional 10 million. Will help alleviate the poverty for an additional 10 million people. For Jason, who right now isn't eligible for even $1 VTC, the credit under my plan would mean about $600 for him. So in a sense, he is taxed further into poverty because he gets no help from the Earned Income Tax Credit. And we know what this means. We know what the Earned Income Tax Credit means. Beyond putting money in families' pockets, we know what it means. Similar to the Children's Health Insurance Program. I'm introducing that legislation in the next week or so. That's been bipartisan for 20 years. In my state, it's 130,000 children benefit from the CHIP program, the Children's Health Insurance Program. And what that means is not just giving parents the peace of mind of knowing their children have insurance, not just EITC and CTC giving a parent some peace of mind that they can do a few things for their children that they couldn't do. It also means better performance in schools. It means they miss fewer school days. It means when they're at school, they're less likely to be sick. And they're maybe less likely to be hungry because they have a little bit more money and their parents have a little bit more money in their pocket. And if we care about not just these families in these neighborhoods, but this society, so we raise children that would have higher test scores, I mean, provably higher test scores, higher graduation rates, higher college attendance rates, and more people getting GEDs, more people going to college, more people finishing college. It means working more hours. It means higher salaries. It means that we enable the cash poor, the 44% of households that have less than 3 months worth of savings. Almost half of people in this country have less than 3 months of savings at whatever age they are. And if they're in their 50s, we know what that means for their retirement. Half of the people, and more or less half the people in this country who are on Social Security depend on Social Security for more than half their income. So if we're ever going to build wealth in this country and ever give people a chance, young children a chance and older people a chance for retirement, for earning a more secure retirement, EITC and CTC are so very important. But if we fail to act, 50 million. If we fail to renew and make permanent, 50 million Americans could lose part of their EITC or CTC. And in so many ways, that's the worst kind of class warfare aimed at working families. when people that dress like me and have good titles and get good salaries and get good government-paid pensions and health care don't rise to the occasion and don't make permanent EITC and CTC, don't expand those programs, don't do the children's health insurance plan, things that have been bipartisan, don't raise the minimum wage, things that have been bipartisan in this country for most of the last 30 years. The minimum wage now has a third less buying power than it did in 1968. Think about what that means. And it's not mostly teenagers, you know, it's mostly people that support themselves and their families. But it really is, forgetting them, ignoring them while we talk about lowering the corporate tax rate is the worst kind of class warfare. These workers need help out of poverty, not to be taxed into it, and that needs to be our mission. Let me talk about one other bill we're working on, the early refund EITC. David talked about payday lending for a moment. He mentioned it. There are more payday lending stores in the United States today than there are combined McDonald's and Starbucks. More payday lending stores than combined McDonald's and Starbucks. And think about that. In upper income neighborhoods, there's Starbucks and McDonald's. And if you look at the whole country, if there are more payday lenders, think of the concentration of payday lenders in moderate and low income neighborhoods. So what happens for so many people is while the woman Rose I mentioned from Toledo, Ohio, she depends on EITC, on that check she gets in February or March or April. She depends on that check to pay down her bills, just to catch up. And what if in October Rose has some unforeseen problem that costs money, which poor people always are more likely to have. And her car breaks down, and she can't go to work because her car breaks down. So she's got to go to a payday lender because she hasn't gotten her EITC refund, because that's not for 4 months. So she has to go to a payday lender. And once she goes to a payday lender, the average person that goes to a payday lender, Dr. Edin, help me with this, I think goes 7 times. And so that you get the first payday loan, and you can't pay it all back, so you go again and again and again and again. You end up paying 200, 300% or more. Some testified up to 500% often interest. So once you're in that downward spiral where you've got to borrow money against your EITC or just borrow money to stay alive because your car is more likely to break down. About 20 years ago when I lived in Columbus, I tutored a young man, actually a man about my age, who had dropped out of high school, and he wanted to learn to read so he could read, he could get a better job. He worked as a parking attendant in a hospital. And he wanted to be able to read out loud from the Bible at his church. And about 1 out of 4 times we would meet, because I had young children and I was a single parent, and on Sunday nights I couldn't really leave the house because they were small. He'd come to my house and I'd tutor him. And about 1 out of 4 days, about 1 out of 4 nights, we do it every Sunday night, his car would break down. He just couldn't get there. And my car didn't break down. I had a good job, and I had decent income, and I had a car that was 3 years old or something. He had a car that was 12 years old or whatever it was. And I mean, the costs that, obviously, I'm preaching to you, you know that, the costs of people that it costs money to be poor. And so that's the reason for this event. So the way this bill would work is, and I'm hopeful that we have a real shot, because I'm hopeful we can get some real bipartisan support, as we've had in the past on EITC and CTC, is to allow an up to $500 early, if you will, advance, not paying interest on it. It costs the government very little money to do this. If your car breaks down in October, you can get a $500 advance. That will then mean you get, and when you get your refund, it's $500 less, of course, but it can keep people out of that downward cycle of getting a payday loan, and then what all that means. So I'll close with this. As you advocate around here, tell your stories. Tell this story. I mean, you all are in this business. Pope Francis said, a few months ago, he exhorted his parish priests to go out and smell like the flock. Go out and smell like the flock. I mean, think of the biblical connotations of that. But go out. We do public policy in this town, and we are supposed to understand the lives of a broad section of people. And we don't do that well enough. Lincoln, when he was president, his advisors wanted him to stay in the White House and free the slaves and win the war and preserve the Union. He said, no, I got to go out and get my public opinion baths. And it's important that we go out and listen to people and hear the stories of Rose and hear the stories of Jason and hear the stories that we then pass on to policymakers and others. And I'll close with this. John Lewis, who is a number of us, including Senator Tim Scott, who I think has a representative here today, and Tim and I are on the Finance Committee and hope we can do some EITC things. We've had preliminary discussions. Tim and I are leading the congressional delegation to go to Selma to mark the 50th anniversary. And I was able to take my young daughters there back in 1998, the first time we did a sort of congressional trip. And there were about 6 of us from the House of Representatives that went, and John was among them. But John tells a story when he spoke at Emory University commencement this year, and I want to just actually read the words that he said because they were way better than I would say them otherwise. He said when he was a kid, I saw those signs that said, and John was born in 1940, so these stories would have been in the 40s and 50s. I saw those signs that said white men, colored men, white women, colored women, white waiting room, colored waiting room. I came home, I had asked my mother, my father, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, why? They would say, that's the way it is, John. Don't get in the way, don't get in trouble. In 1957, at the age of 17, I met Rosa Parks. In 1958, at the age of 18, I met Martin Luther King Jr. These 2 individuals inspired me to get in the way, to get in trouble. So I encourage you, he's exhorting these graduates, so I encourage you to find a way to get in the way, find a way to get in trouble, get in good, necessary trouble. So as you tell your stories, as you tell stories of people that you fight for, think about always getting in good trouble, necessary trouble, and encouraging your friends to do the same. Thanks.
Is there time for questions? Or if you have time for a couple questions, is there time?
I think we have time for one question. Okay. Maybe you can group them up.
Too many stories. See, the other thing about telling stories, you don't have to talk, you don't have to take questions then.
Hi there, I'm back.
Yeah. Hi, Rob Carter from Congressman Posey. I'll just say, start. I'm an actual VITA volunteer, tax attorney. I have to say, I've been in briefings with very good conservative theorists that actually say that EITC is actually a better solution to helping poor than the minimum wage. We can debate the minimum wage another time. I will say, in actually personal experience, my in-laws were actually ID fraud, and people used, and this is the issue about EITC fraud. They had 8 kids, somebody invented another 2 kids, filed, got an EITC refund on a debit card, and really I'm here, in-laws, I'm here from accountants in the district. How do we cut down on the EITC fraud, on the debit card fraud, and generally, if we can cut down on those things, the amazingly abused program, we can actually provide more EITC to people. So,
Thank you for raising that issue. Opponents to EITC expansion and permanence will use a 23 or 25% fraud number. That number is misleading in part because unlike tax returns for higher income people, there rarely is a challenge to an audit from an EITC beneficiary than there might be to somebody whose income is much higher, number one. So the 23% number would be dramatically reduced, maybe as much as 50%, if the process of appeal were to play out, because in many, many, many cases, it's the government's mistake, not the EITC filer. Number two, sometimes the EITC credit, the EITC check that goes to the beneficiary, to the taxpayer, to the earner, he earned this, she earned this, is actually an underpayment. So that's part of that 23%. Important to keep that in mind. And to make, and also important that I had a conversation with a senator who will remain nameless for this conversation, who said to me, brought up the 23%, and I said, well, then we obviously should audit these returns and clean that up. And I said, but but if you put more into EITC enforcement, Democrats aren't going to, this was a Republican, Democrats aren't going to support more EITC enforcement, but not more corporate tax and higher income tax enforcement. And he said, well, then we should do that too. And I said, but you guys want to keep cutting IRS funding so that we do fewer audits. So let's play this straight and let's play this honest and let's do it in a way that's fair. But we don't seem to back away from other federal tax policies because there is some fraud. And in most cases, this fraud here is only a few dollars. There's not that much money at stake per taxpayer compared to real fraud or real mispayment or underpayment or overpayment among higher income people. So I appreciate your comments. I think we need to deal with this. I think we need to answer that question better than I just did with facts and figures. But that's simply not a reason in my mind not to do that. And thank you for being a VITA worker volunteer too. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Senator Brown. That was great. We appreciate your fight for low and moderate income working families throughout the country. It is my great honor, really, to introduce Professor Edin, who is the distinguished Bloomberg professor in the Department of Sociology at Johns Hopkins University. She insisted that I call her Kathy, which is uncomfortable, but I will. In her new book, It's Not Like I Pour, Kathy and her co-authors really provide what is a very clear picture of the complex financial lives of low-income Americans in this country. It is a phenomenal book. I encourage each and every one of you to get a copy of it. It is moving, it is insightful, and it is actually quite prescriptive, which is important for this crowd. There are great proposals for reform that I hope we can talk about today. So please join me in welcoming Kathy so she can tell us all about it.
So I look like one person. I'm actually 5 people. Lisa Adams is the best literary agent in the nation. If not, she's the best for academics who actually want to write things people want to read. Also, my co-authors, Sarah, Laura, and Jen, started out as my graduate students. 3 graduations, 3 academic jobs, 3 marriages, and 5 children later, they are now people and scholars in their own right. So just imagine a cast of 5 up here as I speak. I'm going to start with a story about my former dean at the Kennedy School and good friend David Ellwood. Many of you know that during the 1980s, he gave us the first evidence that most welfare recipients, then AFDC, were not long-term, but rather short-term recipients, and he went around the country trying to defend welfare. He soon found that this was the worst job in America. He got hate mail. He was vilified on the Oprah Winfrey Show. There was even a fight that was caught on camera. Even recipients of the program refused to defend it, and all of this led him to a critical insight. That any effort to help the poor that would have any real long-term viability had to be fully in line with American values, especially the primacy of work and the independence of the individual. Based on this insight, he came to Washington with an idea. He was helped by lots of folks, Wendell Primus, Janet Holzblatt, Bruce Reed. But under David Ellwood's inspirational leadership at ASPE, the modern EITC was born. Of course, the first EITC was birthed in 1975, but you might want to think of this as a flourishing from adolescence to adulthood. And the world really changed for poor people. Now, how I come into this story is in the early 90s, I was traveling around the country interviewing hundreds of low-income mothers, both welfare recipients and workers, about how they paid their bills. So I wrote a book with Laura Lane called Making Ends Meet, really describing this incredible struggle that both those who were on welfare, but especially those who were trying to hold down a job, had in just making the basic bills and all of the ways the shortfalls were causing problems for families. So imagine my surprise when in 2007 I returned to the field to talk with poor people about their budgets, most centrally poor workers who were receiving the modern EITC. What I found was so fundamentally different than what I had seen in the early 90s. As it turned out, this Made in America program, we invented this policy prescription right here in this country, was not making people feel stigmatized and shamed the way welfare had. When you collected welfare in the old days, and this is still true, it was almost as if you had to trade your citizenship card. You had to cross the road from being a citizen to being an outcast in order to collect that benefit. In East Boston, where some of this research was done, there is an old, Dickensian visage of a welfare office, with the words over the door, the overseers of the public welfare, and just with wire mesh covering the windows. Imagine the experience of walking through those doors as compared to the experience of walking through the friendly doors of a VITA site or an H&R Block to claim your benefits like every other taxpayer. So in short, what I learned is that while welfare, our traditional way of aiding the poor, led to separation, what the EITC seemed to be doing for people was making them feel a sense of incorporation. Right? The very famous slogan of that year that H&R Block was using, "I got people," was repeated again and again in interviews as people described the incorporating experience of feeling that the government was rewarding them for doing the right thing and going out and working. And perhaps the most profound thing that was different about the interviews we were conducting in the late 2000s as opposed to the early 1990s was the sense of hope. Hope for upward mobility. Hope for upward mobility. This was almost absent from the narratives of the folks in the early 1990s, that this big lump sum at tax time, $6,000, $7,000, sometimes $8,000, 40% of your income, could inspire. Now, this sense of hopefulness, this attachment of the EITC to work, this sense that you're getting something you deserve, that you've earned like every other taxpayer, turns out to shape how people spend the money. Now, you might think, if you give a poor person $6,000 or $7,000 at tax time, they'll blow it. Everybody will be going on a fantasy vacation. Instead, what we found is remarkably responsible financial behavior. What we did is we followed 110 tax filers from the moment they received their refund to 6 months later, when usually the EITC was fully allocated. We found that 25% went to debt. Some of that debt was accrued during the year, as Senator Brown alluded to, because in actuality, you usually can't make ends meet on your wages alone. But another half of that debt was for a very long-term debt that people wanted to clean up on so they can move ahead and acquire more assets, most centrally a home. Another 25%, roughly a little less than 25%, was spent in current consumption, paying those bills that you usually can't pay every month, and in paying ahead, in particular for car insurance and rents, so as to kind of create a personal safety net for the hard times that so often come and the work interruptions that can almost be counted on. 40% went to mobility purposes. So those of you in the asset field can cheer. About 17% of that was, of the total was for savings. The rest was generally for durable goods, often cars, standalone freezers that allowed you to live more cheaply and allowed you greater access to wider labor markets and higher education. And then there was just a little bit extra, about 10% of the average refund, to invest in your kids. So I'm going to tell you one story. This story was really near and dear to my heart. The mom's name is Deborah McKinney. She lives in Boston. She had a fourth grader who was really struggling in school. And it turns out that the fourth grader's birthday was right about the time when she usually claimed her credit. So she said, if you can pass the fourth grade, when tax time comes around next, I'm going to take you to the best seafood restaurant in America, because this little girl loved seafood. So indeed, her little girl passed the fourth grade. So tax time came around, and the family, had to find the best seafood restaurant in America. And it turns out that although Boston has many fine seafood restaurants, it does not have the best seafood restaurant in America. And indeed, you can't even find the best seafood restaurant in America in Massachusetts because Massachusetts has no Red Lobster chains. So the entire family hopped in the car, drove all the way to Connecticut, and that $64 spent on that little girl's meal was the best part of that mother's year. So 10% goes to support people's identities as parents. There are shortcomings of relying so much on the tax code. We know that TANF isn't doing its job. It's not acting as the safety net for people for whom work just doesn't work sometimes the way it should. We used to cover about 60% of the poor with TANF. Now it's about a little over 25%. And recent work that Luke Schaefer and I have done has shown a growing proportion of American households forced to survive on less than $2 per person per day in cash income. We need a vigorous, temporary safety net when the EITC is not enough, when work is not enough. We also need to expand work opportunity. There are simply too few jobs, too few hours to go around. It is almost impossible now for many poor parents supporting children to find full-time work. We've also found in our field work that work can be healing in and of itself. It can provide this sense of incorporation that is so vital, so important, as long as that work has enough give. In conclusion, I would say in doing this work and collecting these stories, and by the way, if you read the book, you can have stories of your own, even if you haven't managed to go back and collect them yourselves. The critical insight we really came away from doing this work was that everybody longs to contribute. Part of the reason people felt so proud to claim this credit is that it was like a badge of honor that they were members of their communities. They were citizens. They were taxpayers. They were playing by the rules. They were making a contribution. Over and over again, families said, I felt like a real American. So I encourage you in your efforts to advance the EITC, and thanks for coming.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you so much for speaking and for really pushing the field forward with your research. I'm really happy to invite the moderator of our panel, Greg Kaufman, to join us. It occurs to me listening to both Senator Brown and Professor Edin that Greg is fundamentally a storyteller. What he's done is told stories through his work now as editor of TalkPoverty.org, telling stories of people who are in poverty and people who are fighting poverty. He did the same when he had a weekly column with The Nation, This Week in Poverty. So he has been fighting this fight for many years. He's been described as one of the most consistent voices in poverty, on poverty in America, and I would just add to that, consistently thoughtful and consistently on point. So we're excited to have him. Please join me in welcoming him and the rest of the panelists.
Well, thank you so much, Ezra, for that kind introduction. I have the pleasure of moderating this distinguished panel. I'm going to introduce each of them to you. Seated right next to me is Lori Ann Sales. Lori Ann works with the National Institute of Health's National Human Genome Research Institute. And along the lines of the importance of telling stories around the numbers, Lori's going to help us with that today. So thank you, Lori, for being here. You met Dr. Edin, the distinguished Bloomberg professor in the Department of Sociology at Johns Hopkins University. Can't say enough about the book that you and your co-authors have recently published. It's Not Like I'm Poor. I know you're not going to hawk it, but I will. I think you should all buy it. Seated at the next table is Chai-Ching Huang, Senior Tax Policy Analyst at the DC-based think tank Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Welcome, Chai-Ching. And at the end of the table there
is Barb Montegani, past president and current board member of the Community Tax Aid, which runs these critical VITA sites throughout the DC area. So let's get right to it. I'm going to start with Lori. A little background information about you, Lori, first that you had shared with me that folks here would be interested in. You face the prospect of being a single mother without a high school diploma, but you graduated high school on time. You went on to earn a BA in public health at University of Maryland College Park. Go Terps. I'm a Marylander myself. And you went on to earn a master's in public administration with honors, I believe, at University of Baltimore. All of this while working full-time and raising your daughter. And last year, not only did you get married, but you were a candidate for delegate to Maryland General Assembly at the same time. Came up a little short, but it was a good run, and we're rooting for you. And after this panel is over, we'll talk about your film rights. I'm very interested. You have quite a story. But you said that family and various government programs were really essential to your success, including, of course, particularly your experience with the EITC. And could you just talk about how that helped both you and your daughter?
So I think the senator touched on it a lot. You know, that time and, you know, over the months waiting for you to file your taxes, you kind of incur, you know, a lot of unnecessary or unexpected expenses, whether it's with your car breaking down or aftercare. And, you know, when you have this opportunity to, you know, have this extra money at a time when, you know, it's unexpected, it really puts you in a more comfortable feeling. Being in poverty and being low income, it's a sense of stress, and you're not really sure of what to expect day to day. So it kind of gets you back on track. It's a little cushion to help, you know, along the way throughout the year. So.
And how would you see that impact your daughter in particular?
Well, she got to take advantage of after-school activities. I was able to put her into ballet classes, and you know, being a single parent, you kind of want to overcompensate for what you think your child is missing out on, and so being able to do those extra little things, I think it really made her feel like she wasn't different from anyone else. She wasn't missing out on anything, so it really helped a lot.
And in terms of obtaining the EITC, Dr. Edin and Senator Brown both mentioned the importance of VITA sites.
Yes.
Can you talk about what that did for you and your family?
So, you know, going to those sites and, you know, having the people volunteer their time to help you, it's a reassuring feeling. It's a comforting feeling. You know, you don't have the stigma of someone looking down at you, and you know, you're in an environment where people are ready to help you, and it's a comforting feeling to know that those services are available to people in need. And you know, I learned about the VITA because I joined the Montgomery County Community Action Agency because I wanted to be able to advocate for people who were in my position and really speak to the issues that would affect them. And, you know, knowing firsthand on the planning side and how much of a benefit this would be to people, and really being able to contribute to the services provided at those sites was a really good feeling.
And I promise I'm going to get to the rest of the panel, but just one more thing, because you actually had an experience with a non-VITA site, and you can really contrast the two. Can you talk a little about that?
So before becoming acquainted with the VITA sites, I didn't go to H&R Block. I went to a private tax preparer that I found in the Yellow Pages, and I feel like I was taken advantage of. I wasn't too sure about, you know, what deductions I should have, whether I should itemize or take the blanket deduction, and, you know, not being aware of what your options are, what your rights are. You kind of just say, you know, I'm in need of money, I'm going to do whatever I can, and I did not get what I was supposed to get on my return. And, luckily we have the trusted VITA sites that are available so that people aren't taken advantage of in those situations. So,
thank you. And Dr. Edin, Lorianne's experience, both in terms of the VITA and non-VITA sites, and her and her daughter's experience with the EITC, is this consistent with a lot of the experiences of families you've spoken with through your work?
So people love the symbolic act of filing their taxes with other taxpayers, whether it's at a VITA site or not, right? But the fees you pay at VITA sites are meaningful, and the temptation, of course, to get whatever it's called now, we can't do a rapid refund, but H&R Block has found a way around that. So the temptation to pay a very heavy price to get some of your refund early is real, especially when you have debt collectors breathing down your back. But the thing that I really heard Lorianne say was, the relief of parental stress, the ways in which the EITC can scaffold your efforts to make your child feel like an ordinary American kid are very, very consistent. And again, it's not like the ballet lessons or one meal at Red Lobster a year is an extravagant parental expenditure, but the symbolism of those expenditures is so powerful, both for a parent and for a child. And what we really want is for all people to feel part of America. We want all people to participate in their communities. And what Lorianne was saying, what we heard in the field, was that this program and the way that we administer this program really has those benefits.
Along those lines, I could be wrong about this, but wasn't there some research about EITC beneficiaries or participants, I should say, being more likely to vote, for example? Did I read that in?
Well, we don't have direct evidence of that, but we do know from Joe Sassa's work that when you deliver benefits to people in a way that respects their dignity and treats them as citizens, they are more likely to vote. I think there are probably all kinds of spillover effects that are positive from the EITC above and beyond, the health effects that have been documented, for example. So researchers ought to get out there and look at these sort of citizenship benefits as well as the financial benefits.
Yeah, thank you. And Chai-Ching, there has been a lot of research on some of the long-term impacts of the ITC, and I think particularly as they relate to children, if you could speak some to that and some of the other long-term impacts.
Yeah, I think there's a striking body of growing, there's this research that just keeps coming. It's really fascinating, that's showing that the ITC has benefits across a life cycle, and that's, you're right, particularly the case for children and families that receive the EITC. So, for example, there's links between increased EITCs and improved maternal and infant health. So right at the beginning, that's really important. And then onto the schooling. There's research that shows that higher EITCs are linked to better school performance in elementary and middle school. And now we're starting to see the research that shows that there's a boost in college enrollment associated with large EITCs. And the researchers think that that's because of the better school performance all the way through, but also because it makes college more affordable. And then, finally, one step further, we're starting to see research that children who grow up in families with increased income from the EITCs, when they get to adulthood themselves, they're more likely to actually work more and earn more. So all the way through, we're seeing these really important impacts. And I think, going back to the theme about VITA, these impacts can't happen if people don't claim the credits that they're owed. And that's why, Barb's work and all the volunteers' work is just so fantastic.
And that's exactly where I was going. But that research is pretty astounding. But Barb, I do want to bring you in here. The Community Tax Aid, which you're on the board of, runs VITA sites throughout DC. Can you tell me, kind of look at the supply and demand of sites in this area, and to the extent you're comfortable, how that looks nationally as well?
Sure. First, I have to warn you all, I am not rational about the EITC or about VITA or about the importance of what it is that we do. So my husband warned me not to get too emotional this morning, but I will tell you that there is a lot, there is support, there are numbers, there is data, there is research, and then there are people. And for 25 years, I have been helping these people. And the research and the data reflects what I have been seeing for 25 years. And there is not enough of a supply of people. The number of people that the combined community tax aid, the various local counties and jurisdictions have their own programs that they run. AARP has a very big program, which is terrific. But you put all of those programs together, and you do not have enough people to be able to do a return for every single person who is entitled to claim the credit, which means that you have people going to preparers who charge them too much money, or worse, the upside of electronic filing and of TurboTax and programs like that is that it can make it easier and things can go faster and so forth. The downside of those things is that anybody with enough money to buy a copy of TurboTax can go out and say, hey, I can do your tax return for you. People who don't know anything of what they're doing, and people who will deliberately create fraudulent returns that the taxpayer, him or herself, doesn't even know about. There's a volunteer that's volunteering with our program this year who is in the IRS in the enforcement division who's prosecuting criminal fraud. And one of the very significant things that he's doing is prosecuting cases against preparers who basically prepare parallel returns. So as far as the taxpayer knows, they're getting a return, they're getting the refund that they're due, and then there's this return that's filed that's all fakey that has a much bigger refund, and that refund goes into the preparer's account. And so as far as the client knows, they're filing the right thing. And so anyway, they're prosecuting these people, but again, as the senator mentioned, there's not a lot of funding and so forth. So the demand is huge, the supply is very narrow, and Congress really needs to take a better look at how to both fund the preparation efforts, and also, I will throw in here quickly and then I'll stop talking, is that the IRS tried to create rules to regulate preparers, to regulate who can do it, to require them to go through a particular training, get a certification, and a court knocked that down and said, oh, sorry, you don't have the authority to do that. And full disclosure, I also worked at the IRS for 4 years. So the point being that since the IRS has been told that they don't have the power to impose rules to regulate preparers, Congress has to do it. Because somebody has to do it, because my clients come in after having been taken advantage of by these people, and they owe now refunds that, okay, they weren't entitled to them, but they didn't know they weren't entitled to them. And they keep paying off that debt to the government. And so, again, I'm not rational about it, but there does need to be some degree of regulation so that you can go out to the community and say to these people, don't have your return done unless somebody can show you that they have this certification. The taxpayers aren't going out there going, oh, let me find somebody that's gonna do a fraudulent return. You educate them and they'll do the right thing. All right, I'm done.
I'd love to pick up on that point.
Please do, yeah.
It relates to part of the conversation we had earlier about error, and the data does back up your irrational feeling, and that the data show that VITA sites have the highest accuracy rate of any type of preparers, and that is partially because VITA volunteers have to go through certification and show that they're competent to file these returns. In contrast, unenrolled preparers that don't have to go through any competency certification have the highest error rate. And that's why I think, in addressing this error issue, this regulation of return preparers is really important.
And so, and if I'm hearing correctly, it doesn't sound like right now, though, that there's a lot of political will in terms of expanding the supply of VITA, the number of VITA sites. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that or can comment on it.
The funding for low-income taxpayer clinics, at best, it's stagnant. My organization, Community Tax Aid, applies for grants every year, and in order to fund our operations, and there's just not enough to fund all of the sites, because you can fund a legal clinic that can help taxpayers once they've gotten into trouble, but truly, if you fund the people who are actually doing the returns, then they're right, and then the number of times that a taxpayer will get into trouble will be less. So, you sort of address the problem there. But the funding, I don't have the numbers of the funding, but I can tell you that at best it's stagnant, and it has not kept up with the demand.
Okay, thank you. And I want to stay with the politics for a little. I mean, we have this, Senator Brown had mentioned EITC expanded under, bipartisan presidents, both parties. It's sort of a feel-good story. I think we have a little bit of a potential storm on the horizon. I want to look at Chai-Ching, if you can tell us a little bit about the EITC and child tax credit expansions that are set to expire in 2017, and why we really need to be paying attention to that.
Yeah, so unless policymakers do act at the end of 2017, 3 really key provisions of the EITC and the CTC will expire. That means that millions of families will face a loss of some or all of their credits, and it would push more than 16 million people in working families, including 8 million children, into or deeper into poverty. So this is a big deal, and this is something that we think is a really critical priority for Congress. But again, going back to the stories, what does that mean if you think about a single mother with 2 children who is working full-time at the minimum wage, earning $14,500, she would face a loss of her entire child tax credit. She would lose $1,725. And as Kathy's research, if you look at the book, that is a really important amount for people who are struggling to get by and working and trying to raise children. So making those critical provisions permanent is, we think, a really critical priority for this Congress. And we've heard news in the House just over the last couple of days that there's an effort to make some other expiring tax breaks permanent, including some tax breaks for corporations. Without getting into the merits of those particular tax provisions, we think that if anything gets made permanent, that these critical credits for working families have to go along with them.
Did anyone have anything to add to that? Yeah, please.
So anyone who hears that number, 14,500, must be thinking, how can anyone live on that? And in sort of meticulous analysis of these families' budgets, you won't be surprised to hear that they can't. We've made a pledge for a long time as this country that if you work, if you play by the rules, you ought to not be poor and you ought to get ahead. And the EITC is the way we make good on that promise in America. Even so, nobody is living high off the hog on the EITC. They are barely scraping by. This little bit of surplus that comes through forced savings is invested in responsible economic behavior that I think all of us would applaud. The fact that almost $1.05 is actually put away and saved is quite amazing. So it's easy to lose sight of how tough families' economic situations are and how unstable the labor market is. And the EITC's value in not only making work pay, but in building a personal safety net so as to weather what's going on now with low-wage employment is critical and should be, people ought to get rewarded for playing by the rules, and this is the way we make that happen here in America.
Thank you. Senator Brown also alluded to an effort to expand the EITC for childless workers. Chai-Ching, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about why that's critical, who benefits, and that sort of.
So, I mean, at the moment, we call them childless workers, and that really means childless adults and non-custodial parents. And filers under age 25 who are not filing and claiming children are completely ineligible for the EITC at the moment. And those who are eligible for a very small amount. And again, someone working full-time at the minimum wage, they would get an EITC of $25 if they were a childless worker. So this is very small. And in part because of that glaring gap in the EITC, childless workers, low-income childless workers, are the sole group for which federal income and payroll taxes actually tax that group deeper into poverty. So making more childless workers eligible for the EITC and boosting it so that it's an amount that's salient for their lives, that holds really strong promise of increasing employment. Some of the same effects that we've seen for the EITC for families with children, and also reducing poverty. So I think that's a really important policy priority. And going back to your question about congressional interest in it, this is one where there has been bipartisan interest, and I think we're really encouraged about that.
That's great. Did anyone else have anything to say on that?
Just in terms of my clients, it's funny, it's hard for me to explain to my clients why they don't get anything. And, you don't want to encourage them to go have children. But it's hard because they're working very hard, and even if they get the maximum credit, it's less than $500. And that's on, I don't know, income of $5,000 or $6,000. So it is very, very small, and it's hard from you can say from a policy perspective that you do want to make sure that people who have young children need more support, but that doesn't mean that if you're childless and you're working really hard, that you yourself don't need support. I have to say that when I was right out of law school and making a very small amount of money, and I was filling out my tax return, and I saw this earned income credit thing, and I thought, okay, well, that's true. I don't make that much money, and I'm this and this. And then it said, well, you needed to have a child, and I went, oh, well, I guess I can't get it. But I think it's sort of an underappreciated population.
Yeah, so I think the rub is the hardest for non-custodial parents, many of whom we need desperately to bring into the labor market. I mean, imagine if we could see the gains in non-custodial parents' formal sector work effort like we've seen for single mothers. It would really change the lives of millions of American children. And then there are those non-custodial parents who actually are working and paying child support, and they feel the unfairness of the fact that they're not eligible for the tax credit quite keenly.
And Lorianne, I just wanted to ask you too, through your work with Community Action in Montgomery County,
Yes.
I believe, if you are seeing with regard to the childless workers, non-custodial parents, if you're seeing some of their struggles at the county level, that you can share anything about that.
We definitely are. One of our initiatives that we were at the forefront of last year was actually asking for full restoral of the earned income tax credit for county residents. So we do see a disparity with the people who don't have children, but even residents, in Montgomery County, they match your earned income tax credit at the county level. So it was decreased to 60%, but now it's back to its full restoral because of our advocacy efforts at 80%. So, Montgomery County, being one of the wealthiest counties, understands the extra benefit can help a family goes a long way. So.
And that's a whole nother subject, the state EITC, and I actually wasn't familiar with counties working on that as well. That's great. Professor Edin, and we're going to leave plenty of time for audience questions, but I did, in a recent interview that you did with tax credits for working families, there was this great quote you said, in getting to know the families through research and interviews, you said it'll really, quote, help you think more intelligently about policy and the poor, whether you are conservative or liberal. Can you talk some about that? I found that fascinating.
So like many at this table, when we conducted this research, all of the authors trained as volunteer tax preparers. Can I say the test is hard? So I had to try a couple of times, as it should be. I think it took me, quite a long time to pass it. And my entire class of 30 students at the Kennedy School, we all manned 2 VITA sites in Boston, one in the Dorchester neighborhood and one in East Boston. And if you want to know, how poor people think, what their lives are like, there's no better way than to follow the money. It's a poignant time, I think, sitting across the desk from a family or an individual filing their taxes. You learn, it's kind of an intimate moment where you learn some very private things about an individual. It is a chance for you to build on that feeling that people so value that they're really citizens and taxpayers. So you can give a lot just even in that interaction. But you'll come away with an understanding of the plight of the working poor that I think will really transform you and help you, when you act, you will have the voices of real people in the back of your mind, which is, of course, is always better than acting without that.
Thank you.
And
Go ahead, Barb.
if I can just throw one more thing in about the actual experience of working with the clients, they have to tell you very personal things because you need to know about their children and where they're living and what they've been doing and if they've lost their job, they're upset about that. And so you really have to deal with them on a very personal level. And I had a client years ago, and I was at someone else's site, so I was doing the return. And if I start like crying, don't get upset. But this woman had been through just a horrendous situation. She had been evicted from her apartment because she'd lost her job, and she was in a homeless shelter with her children, and then her sister took in the children but wouldn't take her in. She was still at the shelter anyway. She got a job at the CVS working at the 1 hour photo. Now, this is a job that some of us might not value all that much, right? We might not think that was such a great thing. This was the most wonderful thing in this woman's life. She came in for me to do her return, and she said how blessed she was that she had this job, and it was great, and the people she worked with were fabulous. And so I did her return, and the previous year, whoever the person was who did the return had somehow not figured out about the Earned Income Credit. So I fill out the return, I get done, and I tell her that she is going to get this refund of like $3,000 something. And she threw her arms around me and she said, "You are giving me my children back." Okay, and you go, oh my God. And because she was going to now have money that she could then put down a security deposit on an apartment. It's not that she couldn't pay the rent from the money she was making from the CVS, but she didn't have the money to be able to get a place to live with her children. And when somebody says to you, you have given me my children back, you carry that with you forever. And it is that profound an impact that this tax credit can make. It's not puppies and babies, and you go taxes, that's so boring, but it is profound, the impact that happens.
Not actually. I forgot a question I had wanted to ask early on, actually. It was really actually for you, Professor Edin, and anyone can comment on it, but that the EITC program, it functions much more than just an income-boosting program. It really has an impact on asset building. And I didn't know if we had addressed that as much as maybe you might like to speak to, or,
As I said, 40% of the refund is typically spent toward mobility purposes. Is 17% of the total is set aside for savings, and much of the rest goes to human capital development and especially durable goods. So there are measurable improvements in people's lives that are labor saving. They're when you could have a standalone refrigerator, you can shop much more efficiently and buy in bulk. They make sort of the day-to-day schedule more doable, especially if you're able to buy and maintain a used vehicle. So these are measurable improvements to people's lives. But maybe what's the most meaningful is the sense that you can get ahead, that you can be something different from what you are now, that you can enter the middle class that the EITC also brings. People not only plan all year for how they're going to spend their EITC, making detailed calculations on the back of envelopes. They have multi-year plans for how they're going to save, how they're going to clean up their credit, how they're going to make that down payment on a home, how they're going to move to a quieter place with safer streets and better schools. These narratives drive them all year long. They keep them going. This is not just an income support. This is really not only a wealth creation device, but a whole different idea of what life can be like in the future.
Thank you. Before we turn to the audience, this is sort of a freebie. Anything I didn't ask any of you guys about that you had really, really hoped to speak to? Wow, that's good. That means I kind of did my job, I guess. All right, audience. And am I calling people? Is that okay? Right here in the front.
So in the same way, we think about times in school as teachable moments. We think of tax time as the tax moment. And the final question that Greg asked really is, how does this moment move beyond just the refund and help build the aspirations that Professor Edin talked about for the future and for asset building? So one of the reasons CFED is so excited to be more deeply part of this movement is because so many of the VITA volunteers have become adamant asset building advocates and want to link a whole set of other services to what's happening at these sites because they see the potential. So I love everybody's idea, starting with Lori again, about how do we leverage this moment? How should we be thinking about the other services, the other products, the other partnerships that we can use at the tax moment?
Well, one of the things that we started doing at our VITA sites in Montgomery County is when you come into signing your name, there's not just a list of, your personal information, but it's also, it links to social services. Do you need help with childcare? Do you need help with training or job skills? And it's a whole form that you fill out, and after you're done preparing your taxes, they'll say, okay, we will refer you to this organization or refer you to that. So, providing an atmosphere where you have partnering organizations there and you kind of weed out what people want at that time, kind of helps them with other services that they may not be aware of. So.
And at our site, and Community Tax Aid tries to do a lot of, we've partnered with various organizations in Virginia for credit counseling. So we will have someone at our site, and so somebody can, either while they're waiting, the interminable wait to get their return done, or after it's done, they go meet with the credit counselor, they can look up their credit score, because many of these people, again, they want to be able to buy a car or buy a house or whatever, and so being able to, we've tried to marry it with a bunch of things, but the credit counseling works really well, and we work in a human services office, so we're able to refer pretty easily, but that's something that works really nicely.
CBPP's fantastic outreach team, I think a couple of them are here today. They run a campaign that helps raise awareness of the credits and also VITA opportunities. And part of what they work on is doing exactly this sort of thing, linking up the opportunities, including for health coverage, for taking up the opportunity to devote some of your income to a savings, a split refund option. And I think in the packet you have a little flyer that will direct you to some information about that and all the opportunities that they're trying to draw attention to.
Great. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry.
So we heard a lot about the tax moment in our interviews, and I want to talk about two things briefly: dignity and debt. It is really incumbent upon the VITA sites to treat clients with as much dignity as possible. Frankly, you've got a heavy competition from the H&R Blocks and the Liberty Taxes because they really know how to treat people as customers. They make them feel valuable, that they have, people. And part of the reason people go to H&R Block rather than a VITA site is because it feels so good to be there. So we need to make sure from the moment people enter the door, from the way the office looks, from how they're treated, that this is a dignity-enhancing moment. Because incorporation is so profoundly attached to how folks are treated when they come in the door. Second, people really want to clean up their debt so they can move ahead. They don't know how to. They have fascinating and maybe even perverse ideas about what debt should be prioritized. We cover this in gory detail in the book. And still in credit counseling and help with understanding how they should prioritize debts and what really counts toward a credit score would be really valuable.
Great. Yeah, on the side there.
Considering political incorporation, to what degree do the VITA sites allow people the opportunity to register to vote? Is that standard protocol, or is that an add-on that some communities would do?
We don't have any connection with registration to vote in any of our sites, but it's a fabulous idea.
We actually have, one of our sites is dedicated to providing opportunities to register voters, open up accounts, so it's definitely a priority to link that service as well. Yeah.
You know, Jared, it's kind of hard for me to see the whole room. So can somebody help me if I'm not seeing people in the back or anything like that? Yeah, thanks.
Hi, this question is for Professor Edin. Does any of your recent research give us any insights about how we can help those low-income taxpayers become more aware of free tax preparation, either in person, like at the VITA sites, or online, like myfreetaxes.com?
Yeah, so it's really hard to compete with those dancing taxmen, right? And tax women on the corner. You know, it's interesting. In Boston, of course, there's been a very long-term and vigorous campaign. The ABCD community organization, which has you know, offices, storefronts in almost every Boston neighborhood, is a major provider of the EITC of the VITA free tax preparation. So it has really become institutionalized there in a way that sort of gets underneath your fingers. However, again, you know, you've got this powerful competition from H&R Block and all of its competitors, and you have the possibility of getting your refund early. If we can attack the debt piece, if we can figure out how to make work pay all of the year. I love the idea of allowing people to withdraw $500 mid-year to avoid a financial cascade. We do need to think more carefully about ways to not let debt be the driver of which door you enter when those tax refunds become available.
Right here.
Elise just mentioned My Free Taxes, and there's been a group of organizations that have worked together to pilot and launch an online preparation service that allows people to do their taxes online for free. And I wonder if you could talk about that both from a supply and demand and volunteer side, but also an inclusion standpoint, since you know that is the increase in online services is something that we're seeing for taxpayers at all levels.
Well, I bank with BB&T, and I know a lot of banks have started offering free tax preparation online. The problem that you run into is if you're not really familiar with all of the tax codes and things that you can really claim on your taxes, then you may incur some hurdles and things that you could have received that you weren't aware of. So it's just being familiar and being well-versed in the tax preparation. It's free, but are you really getting everything that you could?
Yeah, and to that point too, we have tried at various times, Community Tax Aid, to have our biggest site, self-directed tax return prep, but we have people there to sort of help the taxpayers ask questions. They do the returns themselves, but they can ask the questions. But I would say that this is the very population that you really don't want to necessarily make do-it-yourself online tax return preparation available to, because it's hard. And there's lots of things that are very subtle and turn on understanding what certain terms mean. They have a very specific meaning in the tax code that's different from its meaning, its colloquial meaning. And so I'm of two minds. I struggle with that as a return prep service provider. So we're trying out doing something where they can do self-directed and we can kind of supervise how they do the return. And we'll see how that goes. But I do have concerns about the fact that they don't end up getting the maximum benefit out of that approach.
Yeah, right here.
Hi, I'm Susan
Susan Mason from the Intuit Financial Freedom Foundation, and Intuit makes TurboTax, as you know. And a couple of thoughts that I wanted to follow up with. Barbara, I'm a fellow VITA and EITC nerd. Tears come easily to me as well. A couple of thoughts, though. One of the things that you mentioned was about anybody can buy TurboTax and go out and do it. I'd encourage, if anyone's interested in the whole tax fraud issue, yesterday there was a forum at the museum sponsored by the Atlantic, and Intuit was one of the underwriters for that. And just so you know, our CEO was one of the opening speakers, and his point of view was for all of us that are in this tax fraud battle to make sure that we do not put the solutions on the backs of the lowest income. And that is not right, that's not going to get us out of this problem. But I really do encourage you all to go online and look at that discussion. There was some really good discussion there. It was also opened by Senator Enzi and Senator Klobuchar, who were talking about it as well. The second thing, when Andrea opened up, she talked about hope and about this being a hopeful time. And one of the things that at Intuit we're most hopeful about is how we've been donating TurboTax through the free file, and where we've had some of the best success is by partnering with VITAs on that, through providing coaches. And if anyone was interested in using Intuit's product, we would be happy to help. And my emotion's coming out. For the first time, for if anybody who's eligible for our product can actually do both free credit and free state. So that's a new development, and we'd be happy to work with anybody. And Ellen Evans back there is our person on that. But it's not, Free File isn't about Intuit, it's about 14 different software companies that can help with that. And the last thing, Kathy, that's one of the questions that I wanted to ask you is, have you looked at the self-prep in the same way? Because my favorite story is from Harlem, when we had a taxpayer using TurboTax, and our coach, Herman Tejeda, just saw this guy getting more angry and angrier and angrier as he was doing it. And Herman said, "Sir, if you don't like it, don't do this." He said, "No, I have had somebody else do my taxes for 20 years. Is this all there is to it?"
There's a lot of hope in there. That's fair. So people are afraid to do their own taxes. I mean, the idea that you could get audited, that you could owe money, that you could break the law is very intimidating to people. And a lot of the reason why they go to the for-profit tax preparer is they trust them to get it right, which is, makes Lorianne's story all the more tragic. So we need to make sure that those folks are regulated so they do get it right, given the fact they're getting paid quite well for their services. But fear is very much a factor. A lot of our folks self-filed as well, and what we saw is that a lot of folks went to the one person in their network who had sort of mastered TurboTax, and they were paying $30 to that person to help them through the process. So this informal coaching is going on, and we might as well capitalize on it by coaching the coaches so that their error rate's going on. I do think that there's just having returned from the Mississippi Delta, where people are offering, Intuit and other products to their neighbors, and engaging in some of the practices that Barbara was talking about. The opportunity for exploitation here is really, really ripe among vulnerable populations. So we need to be alert to it, and we need to coach the coaches.
Gentlemen, yes, in the red tie.
Yeah, this is a question for Dr. Edin. In interviewing everyone for your book, did you get any sense of that folks understood where they were in terms of the credits phase-in range or the phase-out range? Did they talk about, oh, maybe I earned too much this year, I had much lower credit than I had the year before? Did you get a sense of that affected or consentives or the desire to marry or to not be married?
So we devoted considerable time to asking people these questions, and it was very interesting. There's quite a moral discourse about this. First of all, people really don't know how it works. They know it's attached to work. They know you have to have kids to get it, And they think, and this is true in, in the phase-in range, that the more you work, the more you get. And so people don't think, oh, I should work less because maybe I'll hit the phase-out range. They're really, the people who are at the sweet spot of the credit generally benefit from working more, and they really see it as a motivation to work more hours and not less. They don't know how much they're going to get every year. They have a sense of what it might be if they're multi-year claimants. But the surprise kind of cautions them against sort of pre-spending, and I think that's a good thing. So when Christmas comes and there are all of these pressures to buy, you're still gonna maybe figure out a way to get what your kids need, but you're not going to sort of be as susceptible to to temptations to spend because you're not really sure. And that increases the sense that this is a windfall, a gift from God, as one person said it, better than Christmas. It was all over our interviews. And in fact, Walmart is now using that line, come in for an experience that's better than Christmas. And this sense of surprise, built an anticipation and sort of a sense of joy around the event of collecting, your tax refund that most of us don't have. But that's a really nice moment for families. It's a celebratory moment for families. So they do understand some things, they don't understand others. On balance, I think they understand the right things. That the more you need to have children, and the more you earn, the more you get.
And to the extent that they are then on the downward slope, sometimes they're surprised in not a good way. So you'll say, okay, you're getting $3,000, and they say, what do you mean? Last year I got $4,000. But when you point out to them that their total amount of money that they have in their household is more, but you were able to, you got that better job, and so you earned $3,000 more dollars, then it really doesn't matter to them whether they've gotten the credit or not. Like, they get that. They get that idea that it is better for them to be able to earn more. And so, none of them, as Kathryn, none of them have the thing they can tell, oh, I'm going to go on the, they don't have that idea. They just, they understand that as they earn more, that it's kind of appropriate that people who are earning less should be able to be helped the way they were helped when they were earning less.
Yes, before you talked about the opportunities for exploitation, and it was also mentioned that problems with identity theft. And I know at many VITA sites on our own, one of the biggest challenges that we have are when parents aren't together and who files first. And I know that our VITA team works really hard to help people with an injured spouse situation. And perhaps Barbara, you might want to speak about how the VITA sites help people right themselves from identity theft.
Well, in terms of righting yourself from identity theft, we can't really help with that other than if you have had your identity stolen, you can go to the IRS. The IRS will assign you a special filing number. And we have had clients come in with those so they can file. The more valuable service that we provide to our clients is the dueling parental attempt to file the child situation, where we're able to help the custodial parent who is all worried about having to get this filed because the other parent they know is going to file the child. And we've had situations where we've had to sit down with them, and back in the days when the IRS had money to have walk-in centers, we would say, bring all your paperwork, you can prove this child lives with you, but you're going to have to go and do that. So that's another valuable thing that we can give that if you're not in the VITA world, you might not get.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. Yeah, right there.
Thank you. This is a question I'd like to direct to Kathryn, please. On the question of research that you cited about VITA sites having a higher accuracy rate than others, is that others who were certified or others in the private sector or individuals? If you could just expand on it.
Sure, and we can follow up. The Chector report looked at at various different types of preparers, and the VITA sites had the highest accuracy rate overall. The lowest accuracy rate overall, the highest error rate, was for unenrolled preparers that were not sort of associated with some of the national chains. So there was a special term for those. I can't remember off the top of my head, but those are the types that we're thinking about when you think just sort of like somebody that's just hung out their shingle and got a copy and hasn't gone through any sort of internal certification process that some of the bigger chains might have.
And that's published, peer-reviewed research that we could cite?
We can follow up, and I'll get
Excellent, thank you.
Last question, gentleman right here.
So thank you, Patrick Kane of the EITC Foundation. It's a great event. Thank you all, first and foremost. So my question, so many things traveling around my brain right now. I get really excited about tax time and all that good stuff. But for me, one of the things that's come out of this is, thinking about, the importance of VITA, how pay preparers and their role, and some of the fraudulent things that you all have talked about. But one other thing is just, the fee-for-service model and helping the consumers, prospective VITA clients, as I like to call them, really help them understand how much it's really going to cost them, and seeing that the cost is taking away from their overall family budget. Have any of you thought about showcasing the VITA costs that they have, which is zero, for your clients versus what your competitors are charging? And then secondly, in regards to the research, if there's anything that you could lift up in regards to if you saw any change in behavior as far as VITA clients versus others who understood that they were getting a full refund. Thank you.
The issue of being able to point out to them that walking out the door with your refund means you're walking out with $400 less than you would be walking out with a week from now. That's something that we try always to get that message across. But it's sometimes difficult because they might very well need that money right that night because they need to go pay their payday loan. So it's a very challenging situation for us to be able to make that value proposition when they're really up against it. So what we do is, we try and get out there and start doing returns as early as we possibly can. When they have direct deposit, they can get it in sometimes a week or less, but it's a very challenging thing, and I'd love to figure out a way to help migrate more people to VITA sites, but then we need to be able to have the VITA sites to migrate them to.
Well, a good benefit of that is the flexible hours. You can come after work, and that's an incentive to work around schedules of someone who may have multiple jobs. Another incentive is direct deposit, so it may not be automatic on a debit card, but you could get it within 72 hours. So you can buy savings bonds, and so there are definitely incentives of getting the taxes prepared at the VITA sites, and I think we do a really good job of advertising those benefits, and we actually do an annual report after each session just to show how much money was the average return and things of that nature to really show the benefits of the program.
So it is completely true that when you get that check from H&R Block, what you paid H&R Block is invisible to you. And the little plaque they have in the office as you come in is uninterpretable. You can't figure out from what they're supposed to tell you what your fee will actually be. And so a great role for the VITA sites would be to make the invisible visible, to advertise with great vigor the savings that you can get from a VITA. But you do have to confront the fear of the IRS. People often say, oh, I go to H&R Block or Liberty Tax because I have peace of mind. This audit protection feature that some of these tax preparers offer is very valuable to people because they're so afraid of getting in trouble with the law. And then I think third, what the VITA sites can do that for-profit taxpayers cannot do is they can marry tax preparation with other services. So if the VITA site becomes the place where you can figure out which debt to prioritize so as to clean up your credit score, if the VITA site becomes the place where you're treated with just as much dignity as you're treated in the H&R Block, then you can compete in ways that clearly make it beneficial for folks to go to the VITA site rather than the for-profit.
All right, well, I think that's about our time. I want to thank our great panel. I also want to thank our hosts, CFED and Tax Credits for Working Families, for your great work. And thank all of you for coming. I hope you have a really strong sense of how fantastic these, the EITC, CTC, VITA, how fantastic they are, how they need to be protected and strengthened, and how much hope there is for bipartisan effort on this. I think everybody would love to see some bipartisan effort. So thank you for coming.